On New Year's Eve 1985, a plane carrying one of America's most beloved stars fell from the sky over a quiet Texas field. The official story said engine trouble, but witnesses described something else entirely. Passengers had complained before takeoff. The crew had a history, and certain details from that night were quietly buried. Ricky Nelson's death was called an accident, but the closer anyone looked, the more that explanation started to fall apart. What really happened on that flight? Before the crash, before the questions, before the controversy, there was a boy. A boy with a clean smile, combed hair, and a life that played out on television screens across America every single week. His name was Ricky Nelson. And for millions of families in the 1950s and 1960s, he wasn't just a performer. He was practically a member of the household. From 1952 to 1966, Ricky appeared on The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, a show built around his real family, his real parents, his real brother. 14 years of American life, broadcast in black and white into living rooms from coast to coast. Viewers watched him go from a small boy to a teenager to a young man. They watched his awkward moments, his first attempts at confidence, his early romances. They felt like they knew him. In many ways, that feeling was the most powerful thing about Ricky Nelson, and also the most complicated, because nothing about that life was entirely real. Every episode was written. Every scene was shaped. His emotions, his conflicts, even his growth as a person, all of it was filtered through a script. Ricky Nelson grew up in front of an audience that believed they were seeing the truth. What they were actually seeing was a carefully constructed version of it. And yet, something genuine did break through. That much is undeniable. When Ricky was 13 years old, the story goes that he recorded his first song not for fame, not for money, but to impress a girl. That song was I'm Walkin', released in 1957. It became a hit almost immediately. Within months, Ricky Nelson was not just a television fixture. He was a recording artist with real commercial power. He sold millions of records. His name appeared on charts alongside Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry. For a brief electric stretch of the late 1950s, he was one of the most recognizable young voices in American popular music. Think about what that means for a moment. A teenager, already famous from television, now famous for music too. Two separate industries, two separate audiences, pulling at the same person simultaneously. Most people his age were figuring out who they were in private. Ricky Nelson was doing it in public, on camera, with a nation watching and an expectation attached to every move he made. The pressure underneath that polished image was real, even if it was rarely visible. Fame had arrived before he had the tools to manage it. Success had come before he had the chance to choose it. And as the 1950s faded into the 1960s, as music changed, as culture shifted, as the audience that had grown up watching him began to grow up themselves, Ricky found himself standing at a crossroads that no one around him seemed to fully understand. The people who had loved him as a boy weren't sure how to receive him as a man. The newer generation of rock listeners didn't entirely trust someone whose image had been built on a family sitcom. He was caught between two audiences and fully owned by neither. That tension between the person he was becoming and the person the world insisted he remain would follow Ricky Nelson for the rest of his life. It would shape his music. It would shape his choices. And in ways that would only become clear much later, it may have shaped the circumstances of the night he died. He was searching for something real, something that belonged to him and not to a script. And that search, quiet and persistent, was only just beginning. October 15, 1971. Madison Square Garden, New York City. The building was packed. Thousands of people had come for a rock and roll revival concert, a celebration of the music that had defined the 1950s. Chuck Berry was on the bill, Bo Diddley, Little Richard, and Ricky Nelson. For one night, the giants of early American rock and roll were sharing the same stage. It should have been a triumphant moment, a homecoming of sorts. Instead, it became one of the most painful nights of Ricky Nelson's professional life. He walked out onto that stage with his band, ready to perform. The crowd recognized him. There was applause. For a brief moment, everything felt right. Then he started playing the new material. The songs weren't the old hits. They weren't the polished pop of the late 1950s that the audience had memorized and carried with them for over a decade. They were something different, more country-influenced, more mature, more personal. Ricky Nelson had been evolving as an artist quietly and deliberately, and this was the version of himself he had chosen to bring to Madison Square Garden that night. The crowd did not receive it well. The booing started gradually. Then it grew. Thousands of voices, not cheering, but pushing back. They hadn't come to hear something new. They had come to hear Hello Mary Lou and Travel a Man, and the songs that reminded them of being young. What Ricky was offering them felt like a rejection of a shared memory, and they rejected him right back. He finished the set. He walked off stage. And by most accounts, something shifted in him that night, something that didn't fully shift back. It would be easy to frame that evening as a simple story of an artist ahead of his time, misunderstood by a nostalgic crowd. But the truth is more layered than that. Ricky Nelson had spent his entire public life trying to be what others needed him to be. The obedient son on television, the clean-cut pop star on the radio. And now, for the first time on a major stage, he had tried to be something closer to what he actually was. The response had been brutal. But here is where the story turns in an unexpected direction. Instead of retreating into safer material, instead of going back to the hits and playing the role the audience wanted, Ricky Nelson went home and wrote a song about exactly what had happened. He called it Garden Party. It was released in 1972, and it climbed to #1. The lyrics were direct and personal in a way that very few mainstream pop songs of that era managed to be. The message was clear. He had been at a garden party where no one wanted to hear anything new, and he had made a decision. He would rather play music he believed in than perform for approval he no longer trusted. One line in particular landed with audiences. You can't please everyone, so you've got to please yourself. The irony was striking. The most commercially successful moment of his career in nearly a decade came from a song about refusing to chase commercial success. The audience that had booed him at Madison Square Garden effectively handed him a #1 hit by doing so. But chart success and personal peace are not the same thing. And Ricky Nelson knew the difference. Through the remainder of the 1970s, he kept recording. He kept touring. He leaned further into country rock, a sound that artists like the Eagles would soon take to enormous commercial heights, but that Ricky was exploring earlier and with less fanfare. His albums from this period were uneven in terms of sales. Critics acknowledged his talent without fully championing him. He existed in that uncomfortable middle space that many artists know well, respected enough to keep going, not celebrated enough to feel settled. What kept him grounded, by most accounts, was the band. The Stone Canyon Band, which he had formed in the late 1960s, was not just a backing group. These were musicians he had chosen himself, people he trusted, people who shared his vision of what the music could be. They traveled together, recorded together, and built something that felt genuinely collaborative. For Ricky Nelson, who had spent so much of his career performing within structures built by other people, that mattered deeply. And the touring never stopped. Year after year, city after city, the same rhythms of the road, the same planes, the same schedules, the same logistical shortcuts that come with sustaining a career outside the top tier of commercial stardom. Those routines would continue into December 1985. The same band, the same touring life, the same aircraft. And that is where the story stops being about music entirely. There are accidents that happen without warning. No signs, no history, no way anyone could have seen them coming. And then there are accidents where, looking back, the warnings were everywhere. The crash that killed Ricky Nelson on December 31st, 1985, belongs to the second category. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-3, a plane with a long history in American aviation, reliable in its prime, widely used for decades, and by the mid-1980s, considerably aged. The specific aircraft that carried Ricky Nelson and his band that night had been manufactured decades earlier. It had lived many lives before it became a charter plane ferrying musicians between tour dates. And it had problems. Documented, reported, and in certain cases, quietly set aside. Former passengers and crew members who had traveled on that same aircraft in the period leading up to the crash described experiences that should have raised serious flags. Strange smells inside the cabin, odors that some compared to fuel or something burning, a heating system that behaved inconsistently. These were not vague impressions or exaggerated recollections shared years after the fact. Some of them were reported at the time by people who had reason to pay attention to how an aircraft was performing. The plane was operated by a charter company, and charter aviation in the United States in the early 1980s existed within a regulatory environment that, in retrospect, had significant gaps. The oversight applied to large commercial carriers. The major airlines, with their strict maintenance schedules and federal scrutiny, did not apply with the same force to smaller charter operations. Aircraft could remain in service longer. Maintenance records were not always as rigorously verified. The system, in short, allowed for corners to be cut in ways that larger operations could not easily get away with. This is not speculation. The National Transportation Safety Board, which conducted the official investigation into the crash, identified the heating system as the origin point of the fire that brought the plane down. A fire that started inside the cabin. A fire that spread quickly enough that the people seated away from the cockpit had very little time to respond. That detail, where the fire started and how fast it moved, explained something that many people found deeply unsettling in the days after the crash. Both pilots survived. Ricky Nelson did not. His fiancée Helen Blair did not. For members of his band did not. The people in the cockpit, separated from the cabin by distance and by the direction the fire traveled, made it out. The people in the cabin, where the heating system was located, did not. When the final count was made, 6 people had died in that Texas field on New Year's Eve. 6 people who had boarded a plane that, by multiple accounts, had been giving warning signs for some time. The NTSB investigation confirmed the mechanical origin of the fire. But the investigation also operated within certain limits. Questions about the full maintenance history of the aircraft, about who had inspected it, when, and with what level of care, were addressed, but not exhausted. The charter company's records and practices received scrutiny, but the conclusions that emerged did not fully illuminate the chain of decisions that had kept a troubled aircraft in service. What made this harder to accept was the suggestion, circulating among people close to the traveling party, that concerns had been raised before the flight departed. That someone, possibly more than one person, had noticed something wrong and said so. Whether those concerns were voiced loudly enough to be acted upon, whether they reached the right ears, whether the schedule pressure of a New Year's Eve performance created an environment where hesitation felt like an obstacle rather than a precaution, none of this was ever definitively established. But the question itself is devastating. Because if true, it means the crash was not simply an accident. It means it was an accident that had a window, however brief, during which a different decision could have been made. Think about what that means for the families left behind, for the band members who perished, for Helen Blair, who was set to marry Ricky Nelson, and whose death received far less public attention than his, for the musicians Patrick Woodward, Rick Intveld, Andy Chapin, Bobby Neal, whose names rarely appeared in the headlines that followed the crash, whose stories were swallowed by the larger narrative surrounding the most famous person on that plane. The official investigation gave the public a cause. It said, the heating system failed, a fire started, the plane went down. And that is true, as far as it goes. But cause and full explanation are not the same thing. A heating system doesn't fail in isolation. It fails because of age, or because of poor maintenance, or because warning signs were missed or ignored. The NTSB report told the public what happened. It was considerably less forthcoming about why the conditions that made it possible had been allowed to exist. That gap between what the report confirmed and what it left unexamined is where the real questions live. And those questions were not going away, because within days of the crash, a second layer of reporting had begun to emerge. A layer that had nothing to do with the heating system, and everything to do with what investigators claimed to have found inside the wreckage. That was where the story took a turn that Ricky Nelson's family has been fighting against ever since. In the days immediately following the crash, the mechanical facts were still being assembled. Investigators were working through the wreckage in a field outside DeKalb, Texas. The public was grieving, and the media, as it often does in moments of tragedy involving famous names, was moving fast. Too fast, as it turned out. Within days of the crash, reports began circulating that law enforcement personnel at the scene had found drug paraphernalia in the wreckage. The claim spread quickly. It appeared in newspapers. It moved through television news segments. And almost immediately, the story of Ricky Nelson's death began to shift from a tragedy involving a mechanical failure on an aging aircraft to something that implied a darker, more personal element. The implication was clear, even when it wasn't stated directly. Something had been happening on that plane. Something beyond what the official record would confirm. The problem was that those early reports were never substantiated with the kind of evidence that should be required before a claim becomes public record. No formal charges. No confirmed chain of evidence. No official finding from the NTSB or any law enforcement body that definitively established drug use as a factor in the crash. The reports existed. They circulated. And then, as the investigation settled into its official conclusions around mechanical failure, the drug narrative didn't disappear. It simply went underground, resurfacing periodically in tabloid retrospectives and true crime discussions for decades afterward. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because what happened to Ricky Nelson's reputation in the weeks and months after his death is a case study in how quickly an unverified claim can attach itself to a person's legacy when that person is no longer alive to respond. The NTSB's final determination was unambiguous about the cause of the crash. A fire originating in the cabin heating system. An aging aircraft with documented issues. A chain of mechanical failures that ended in catastrophe. Drug use was not listed as a contributing factor. It was not established as relevant to the sequence of events that brought the plane down. And yet the suggestion lingered, passed from one retelling to the next, reshaping public memory in ways the official record never corrected loudly enough to matter. Ricky Nelson's family pushed back, firmly and consistently. His children, Tracy, Matthew, Gunnar, and Sam, grew up in the shadow of both their father's fame and the rumors that followed his death. They gave interviews. They challenged the narrative. They pointed to the absence of any confirmed evidence and asked, reasonably, why a claim that was never proven had been allowed to define a man who was no longer there to defend himself. Their pushback deserves serious weight. Not because grief automatically confers authority on how a story should be told, but because the standard for attaching a damaging claim to someone's permanent public record should be evidence. And in this case, the evidence was never there. But the drug narrative created a secondary problem beyond reputation. It introduced noise into a story that, without that noise, would have pointed more clearly toward accountability. If the focus remained on the aircraft, on the maintenance failures, on the regulatory gaps, on the charter company's practices, on the warnings that may have been ignored, then questions of responsibility became harder to avoid. Someone had kept that plane in service. Someone had signed off on its condition. Someone had made decisions, financial or logistical or both, that resulted in 6 people boarding an aircraft that should not have been carrying passengers. When the narrative shifted toward personal behavior on the plane, those structural questions became easier to set aside. Whether that shift was deliberate is impossible to say, but its effect was real. There is a pattern that appears with uncomfortable regularity in cases involving the deaths of public figures. The story moves away from systemic failures, the ones that implicate institutions and industries and regulatory bodies, and toward personal failures, the ones that implicate the individual who died. It is easier to say that someone made bad choices than to say that an entire system of oversight failed them. One narrative ends the conversation. The other one opens it. In Ricky Nelson's case, the systemic questions were serious. The DC-3 that carried him had a history that warranted scrutiny. The charter aviation industry of that era had gaps in its oversight that had been noted by aviation safety advocates. The specific heating system that caused the fire had, by multiple accounts, been a known source of concern on previous flights. These were not invented grievances. They were documented realities that the official investigation touched on without fully resolving. And yet, what most people remember, if they remember anything specific about how Ricky Nelson died, is not the heating system. It is the rumor, the suggestion, the implication that was never proven but never fully corrected either. If viewers watching right now have ever found themselves remembering a version of this story that felt more like scandal than tragedy, that reaction is worth examining. Because it says something not just about Ricky Nelson, but about how the media environment of the 1980s processed the deaths of famous people, and about how easily an unverified narrative, repeated often enough, becomes the version that survives. The truth, as best as it can be established from the available record, is this. 6 people died in a field in Texas because a plane with known mechanical problems was in service when it should not have been. The investigation that followed confirmed the mechanical cause, but did not fully illuminate the human decisions that preceded it. And in the space left by that incomplete accounting, a rumor took root and grew. Ricky Nelson deserved a clearer accounting than that. So did Helen Blair. So did Patrick Woodward, Rick Intveld, Andy Chapin, and Bobby Neal, for musicians whose names are rarely spoken in the same breath as the crash that took their lives too. But the story does not end with the investigation. Because in the years and decades that followed, something quieter and more meaningful began to happen. Something that had nothing to do with rumors or reports or regulatory failures. People started listening to the music again, and what they found there surprised them. Time has a way of correcting what the news cycle gets wrong. Not always, not completely, and rarely as loudly as the original damage was done. But in the case of Ricky Nelson, the reassessment that began quietly in the years after his death has grown into something genuine and lasting. It did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived the way most honest reckonings do, slowly through the work itself, through people willing to listen without the noise of rumor clouding what they were hearing. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, music historians and critics had begun returning to Ricky Nelson's catalog with fresh ears and fewer assumptions. What they found was an artist who had been consistently underestimated. Not because his talent was hidden, it had always been visible to anyone paying attention, but because the frame through which most people viewed him had never allowed for the full picture. The television image had followed him everywhere. The boy from the sitcom, the clean-cut teenager, the pop star manufactured by network television and teenage nostalgia. That frame, once established, is remarkably difficult to see past. And for much of his career, it had prevented serious listeners from engaging with what Ricky Nelson was actually doing musically in his later years. What those later years revealed on closer examination was something worth taking seriously. His work with the Stone Canyon Band in the late 1960s and early 1970s represented a genuine creative evolution. He had assembled musicians who shared his interest in country rock, a sound that blended the directness of country music with the energy of rock and roll in ways that felt organic rather than calculated. The band included players of real skill. Rick Intveld, who would later die alongside Ricky in the crash, was among them. These were not session musicians hired to fill space behind a fading celebrity. They were collaborators building something together. The country rock sound that Ricky Nelson was developing in those years predated its mainstream moment. When the Eagles arrived in the early 1970s and turned that genre into one of the decade's dominant commercial forces, critics and industry figures acknowledged the Eagles as pioneers. What received less acknowledgement was that Ricky Nelson had been working in that same territory earlier, with less support and with considerably less credit. That is not a minor historical footnote. It is a meaningful piece of the story of American popular music that got lost in the noise surrounding his personal narrative. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame made its own statement on the matter in 1987, 2 years after the crash, 2 years after the rumors and the headlines and the incomplete investigations. Ricky Nelson was inducted. The acknowledgement was formal and permanent. It said, without ambiguity, that his contribution to the development of American music was real, significant, and worthy of preservation alongside the artists who had defined the form. It did not undo the damage that had been done to his reputation in the months following his death. Recognition rarely does. But it established something important in the official record, a counterweight to the narrative that had taken hold in the tabloid coverage of the crash. His children, meanwhile, were living with a version of this story that was far more personal than any critical reassessment could address. Tracy Nelson had been building her own acting career. Matthew and Gunnar Nelson formed a band together, Nelson, and achieved significant commercial success in the early 1990s, their harmonies carrying an unmistakable echo of their father's vocal quality. Sam Nelson pursued his own path. All four of them grew up navigating the particular difficulty of being a famous person's child in the aftermath of a famous person's complicated death. The public memory of their father was not a clean or settled thing. It was contested, clouded, and in certain corners of the media, still attached to claims that had never been verified. They spoke about it in interviews over the years. They were careful and consistent. They distinguished between what was established and what was rumor. They talked about their father not as a myth or a cautionary tale, but as a person, someone with genuine artistic ambitions, genuine struggles, and genuine love for the music he made and the people he made it with. That human dimension is easy to lose in a story that has been told primarily through the lens of tragedy and controversy. But it matters. It matters because the people who were closest to Ricky Nelson, the ones who traveled with him, recorded with him, grew up as his children, described someone whose identity was far more layered than the image that preceded him everywhere he went. He was, by most accounts, a man who had never entirely reconciled the gap between what he had been made into and what he actually was. The television character, the pop idol, the faded star. None of those labels fit the person his family and bandmates describe. And for someone who had spent his entire public life inside frames built by other people, that gap between the person and the image never fully closed. Garden Party had tried to say that, directly and publicly, in the most commercially successful moment of his later career. The message had landed. The #1 chart position proved that much. But one song, however honest, cannot fully dismantle a mythology built over decades. What the reassessment of his legacy eventually confirmed was something simpler and more durable than any single chart position or Hall of Fame induction. Ricky Nelson had been a real artist, not a manufactured one, not a sitcom novelty who happened to sell records. Someone with a genuine musical sensibility, a genuine creative voice, and a genuine commitment to following that voice even when it cost him commercially. The audience that booed him at Madison Square Garden in 1971 had been wrong. Not wrong to prefer the older songs. Preference is not a moral failing, but wrong in what their reaction implied. That Ricky Nelson had nothing new to offer. That his evolution as an artist was irrelevant. That the boy from the television show was all he had ever been or ever could be. He had been more than that. The evidence was always there, in the recordings, in the choices he made, in the band he built, and the music they created together. It just took time and distance from the noise of how he died for that evidence to be heard clearly. But even as his musical legacy found its footing, one part of the story remained unresolved. The part that had nothing to do with chart positions or critical reassessments or Hall of Fame plaques. The part that lived in the details of that night in Texas, in the maintenance records, in the regulatory gaps, in the warnings that may or may not have been heeded. That part of the story had never been fully told, and the people who deserved a complete accounting of it had been waiting a long time. Some stories reach a conclusion. The evidence is gathered, the facts are confirmed, the responsible parties are identified, and the record is set straight. There is resolution, even if it arrives late and imperfectly. The people affected can point to something official, something documented, something that says, this is what happened, and this is why. The story of what happened on December 31st, 1985 is not that kind of story. It sits in a different category, one that is arguably more common and considerably more frustrating. The kind where the central mechanical facts are established, but the human decisions surrounding those facts remain in a permanent state of partial accounting. where the official record confirms what happened without fully confronting why it was allowed to happen, where the gap between cause and responsibility is wide enough that no one is ever truly held to account. The Douglas DC-3 that carried Ricky Nelson and his band that night went down because of a fire in its cabin heating system. That is confirmed. That is not in dispute. The National Transportation Safety Board said so, and the physical evidence supported their conclusion. On that narrow question, the record is clear. But records can be clear on one question while leaving others entirely open. And the questions that the NTSB report left open were not minor procedural details. They were the questions that mattered most to the people who had lost someone on that plane. Who was responsible for maintaining that aircraft? What did the maintenance records actually show? And how thoroughly were they examined? The charter company that operated the DC-3, who had accountability for the decisions made about keeping it in service? When the heating system showed signs of malfunction on previous flights, and there is testimony suggesting it did, who knew, and what did they do with that knowledge? And perhaps most pointedly, was there a moment before that plane left the ground on New Year's Eve when someone with the authority to stop the flight could have stopped it? These questions did not receive the same clear answers that the mechanical cause received. They were addressed in the way that official investigations address secondary questions, with language that acknowledged their relevance without resolving them. The regulatory environment of charter aviation in the early 1980s was noted as a context. The maintenance history of the aircraft was examined to a degree, but the examination stopped well short of producing the kind of clear accountability that might have brought some measure of closure to the families involved. There is a reason for that, and it is not a comfortable one. Accountability costs something. It costs institutions their reputation. It costs companies their legal standing. It costs regulatory bodies the admission that their oversight failed. When an investigation is conducted by bodies that exist within the same system that failed, when the investigators and the investigated share professional worlds, when the findings have legal and financial implications that extend well beyond any individual crash, the pressure toward incomplete conclusions is real. It does not require conspiracy. It requires only the ordinary human tendency to settle on the explanation that closes the case without opening too many other doors. The door that the NTSB report left most firmly closed was the one marked accountability. The mechanical cause was established. The human chain that led to a mechanically compromised aircraft carrying 6 people to their deaths was not. For the families of those 6 people, that door has never stopped mattering. Helen Blair was 30 years old when she died. She and Ricky Nelson had been planning a life together. Her family grieved privately, largely outside the media spotlight that surrounded the more famous name on the passenger list. Patrick Woodward, Rick Intveld, Andy Chapin, and Bobby Neal were musicians who had dedicated themselves to a craft and to a band leader they believed in. They had families. They had their own histories, their own ambitions, their own reasons to be on that plane beyond simply being in Ricky Nelson's orbit. Their names deserve to be spoken clearly and completely, not as footnotes to a more famous death, but as individuals whose lives ended in the same field, under the same circumstances, with the same absence of full accountability to mark what happened to them. The drug narrative that circulated in the immediate aftermath of the crash did something specific and damaging to the possibility of that accountability. It redirected attention. It gave the public a more personally scandalous story to engage with than the story of a charter company operating a deteriorating aircraft in an under-regulated industry. Scandal is more compelling than negligence. Personal failure is more narratively satisfying than systemic failure. And so the conversation that should have been about maintenance records and regulatory gaps became, in significant part, a conversation about what may or may not have been happening in the cabin of a plane, a conversation built on claims that were never substantiated and never retracted. The people who had genuine questions about the aircraft and the industry never received the public forum that those questions deserved. The families who wanted a clear accounting of how and why that particular plane was in service on that particular night were competing for attention with a rumor that was easier to print and easier to remember. That imbalance between the story that was told and the story that deserved to be told is perhaps the most honest way to summarize what the Ricky Nelson case represents as a matter of public record. Not a conspiracy, not a cover-up in the dramatic sense. Something quieter and more systemic. A failure of follow-through. A settling for the easy explanation when the harder one was available and necessary. There are people who will read the available record on this case and conclude that everything that could have been done was done, that the investigation was thorough within its mandate, that the conclusions were sound, that the questions that remain open are simply the inevitable residue of any imperfect investigation into a complex event. That is a defensible position held by people who have looked at the same evidence. But there are others, including members of the families directly affected, who look at the same record and see something different. They see an aircraft with a documented history of problems that remained in service. They see a regulatory environment that allowed that to happen. They see an investigation that confirmed the mechanical cause without fully pursuing the human accountability behind it. And they see a media narrative that made the harder questions easier to ignore. Both of those perspectives live inside this story. Neither one fully cancels the other. What can be said with confidence is this. 6 people died on New Year's Eve 1985 in circumstances that were not inevitable. The chain of events that ended in that Texas field included human decisions about maintenance, about oversight, about whether to fly, that could have been made differently. The investigation that followed confirmed the mechanical facts and left the human decisions largely unexamined. And the public memory that formed around the crash was shaped as much by unverified rumor as by established fact. Ricky Nelson spent his career searching for something real, something that belonged to him and not to a script, not to an audience's expectations, not to an industry's needs. He found it in pieces, in the music he made in his later years, in the band he built, in the honesty of a song written after one of the most humiliating nights of his professional life. He deserved a death that was examined with the same honesty he had brought to his life. He deserved an accounting that was complete. He deserved to be remembered not through the lens of a rumor that was never proven, but through the reality of what he actually was, a genuine artist, a searching human being, and a person whose death raised questions that the official record never fully answered. So did Helen Blair. So did Patrick Woodward, Rick Intveld, Andy Chapin, and Bobby Neal. The question of what really happened on that flight, not just mechanically, but in the fullest human sense of that question, remains open. Not because the answer is impossible to approach, but because approaching it fully would require a level of honesty that the systems involved have never quite managed to produce. And that, in the end, may be the most important thing the story has to say. Not about Ricky Nelson specifically, but about how the world handles the deaths of people who inconvenience it by dying in ways that implicate something larger than themselves. Some doors, once left closed long enough, become very difficult to open, but they are never impossible. And the fact that the questions are still being asked, that people are still looking at that night, still examining that record, still saying the names of everyone who was on that plane, means that the door has not been locked permanently. It has simply been waiting for someone to push it open all the way. If this story made you think differently about what you thought you knew, about Ricky Nelson, about the media, about the gap between official conclusions and full truth, then consider what other stories might be waiting for the same kind of honest second look. There are more of them than most people realize, and the next one might be closer to home than anyone expects. Some names stay with us. Some stories settle into the back of the mind and refuse to leave quietly. And some deaths, the ones that were never fully explained, never fully accounted for, never fully grieved by a public that thought it knew the whole story, deserve to be revisited not with sensationalism, but with the simple, steady commitment to asking better questions than the ones that were asked the first time. Ricky Nelson was not a perfect person. No honest account of his life would suggest otherwise. He was a human being shaped by extraordinary and often distorting circumstances, famous before he could choose it, defined by an image before he had the chance to build one of his own. He struggled with the gap between who the world needed him to be and who he actually was. He made music that deserved more recognition than it received. He built relationships with his band with his children, with the people who traveled with him and believed in what he was creating, that reflected something genuine about his character. And he died in circumstances that were never fully examined. In a plane with a documented history of problems. In an industry with documented gaps in its oversight. In a media environment that found a rumor more compelling than a maintenance record. With 5 other people whose names and stories were largely swallowed by the coverage of the most famous person among them. That is the complete picture, as honestly as it can be assembled from the available record. Not a simple story of a fated star meeting a tragic end. Not a scandal. Not a conspiracy. Something more human and more troubling than any of those framings allow for. It is a story about what happens when systems fail and no one is held responsible. When investigations confirm causes without pursuing accountability. When rumors fill the space that honest reporting should occupy. When the people asking the hardest questions are the ones who lost the most, and the people with the answers have the least incentive to provide them. Ricky Nelson's musical legacy is secure. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 1987 confirmed what careful listeners had always known, that his contribution to American popular music was real, lasting, and worthy of serious attention. His later work, particularly the country rock recordings that anticipated sounds the mainstream would embrace years after he had been exploring them, stands as evidence of an artist who never stopped growing even when the industry stopped paying attention. His children carry his memory forward. Tracy Matthew Gooner and Sam have each built their own lives and careers in the long shadow of a father who died when they were still young. They have spoken about him with honesty and with love. They have pushed back against the narratives that reduced him to a rumor or a tragedy. They have insisted consistently and correctly that the full person deserves more than the partial story that became the dominant one. Helen Blair deserves to be remembered as more than a footnote. She was 30 years old. She had a life, relationships, and a future that ended in that Texas field on the last night of 1985. Her absence from most retellings of this story is itself a kind of failure, the same failure that reduced her death to context for someone else's. Patrick Woodward, Rick Indveld, Andy Chapin, and Bobby Neal were musicians. Real ones. People who had chosen a life on the road because they believed in the music they were making together. They were not props in someone else's story. They were the story too. And they deserved an accounting of how and why they died that was as complete and as honest as the one their most famous bandmate deserved. The plane should not have been in service. That is the clearest and most honest thing that can be said about what happened on December 31st, 1985. Not as a dramatic conclusion, but as a straightforward statement of what the available evidence suggests. An aging aircraft with a documented history of heating system problems, operated in an industry with insufficient oversight, carrying people whose lives depended on decisions that had been made carelessly or not made at all. The investigation confirmed the mechanical cause. It did not pursue the human accountability with the same determination. And the media coverage that followed prioritized a narrative that was never substantiated over the questions that were. That sequence of failures, mechanical, regulatory, investigative, journalistic, is the true shape of what happened to Ricky Nelson and the 5 people who died alongside him. Understanding that shape does not bring anyone back. It does not undo the grief of the families involved or correct the public record in any official sense. But it does something that matters. It restores the full complexity of a story that was flattened too quickly into something simpler and less true. Ricky Nelson spent the last years of his life making music that said, clearly and without apology, that he would rather be honest than popular. That he would rather play what he believed in than perform what was expected. He said it in a song that reached #1. He said it in the way he built his band and chose his collaborators. He said it in the quiet persistence of a career that kept going long after the spotlight had moved elsewhere. The least that can be offered in return is the same honesty applied to his story. The full picture, not the convenient one. The questions that were never fully answered, not buried under the ones that were easier to close. Some doors take a long time to open, but they open. And now that this one has been pushed a little further, Now that the names have been spoken and the questions have been asked and the record has been examined with the care it deserved from the beginning, the story of what really happened on that New Year's Eve is a little closer to being told completely. Not perfectly, not finally, but honestly. And for Ricky Nelson, for Helen Blair, for Patrick Woodward, Rick Intveld, Andy Chapin, and Bobby Neal, honestly is where it should have started all along. If there is a story in your own memory that never quite sat right, a death, a disappearance, an official conclusion that felt incomplete, the instinct to keep asking is not paranoia. It is the most human response there is to a world that sometimes prefers easy answers over true ones. The next story is already waiting, and it starts with the same simple refusal to accept the version that was handed over without question.